So if you could find a seat, yourselves comfortable. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and I'm delighted to welcome you all. So my name is Alison. I'm Professor of Sexual and Reproductive Health at UCL's Institute for Women's Health, and I'm delighted to open this meeting, which has been put on by out at UCL, which is UCL's LGBTQ plus staff network, jointly with the Institute for Women's Health. So we're delighted about that. And we've got a wonderful agenda for you tonight, perfectly timed with yesterday's events. How many of you were up all night? Oh, look! Fantastic. Yeah, I can't say I was, but there we are. So it adds a certain excitement, a little frisson to the whole thing, I think. So I'm sure you know why you're here. It's to celebrate the achievements of the equality agenda over the last 50 years, or at least to debate the achievements of the equality agenda over the last 50 years. Not disputed, though, that there were two milestone events 50 years ago, the 1967 Abortion Act and the 1967 Sexual Offences Act. So what we're going to do is have some short presentations from our lovely panel here, beautifully gender balanced, I don't know about anything else, and we'll run through those talks without questioning in between, just so that we keep to the timetable and we get to the free drinks on time, okay? So I'm going to be quite fierce about that and not take questions one after each speaker, okay? Save them up, write them down if your memory's a little dodgy, and we'll take all the questions at the end, and hopefully everyone will get their say. Now, what else? I need to say that we're live streaming this, which I'm told means that when you go home, you can go onto YouTube and put in 1967, A Sexual Revolution, and you'll see yourselves at some point in the streaming. Okay, so I think that's all I need to say, Sandy. Is that right? Yeah? Do I need to do the housekeeping fire exit thing?
If you know.
Yeah, where are they?
Yeah.
There's one there, and there's two exits at the back, so it should be okay, all right? If you hear anything alarming, run. Right. So it gives me great pleasure to...
Just take a 15 seconds.
Yeah, introduce
just to, yeah.
Bill, first of all.
Bob.
Bob.
Sorry, just to say, I'm Bob Mills. I'm director of QCL, which is UCL's LGBTQ research network. So it's a group of staff and students at UCL who are interested in issues of gender and sexuality, LGBT studies, queer theory, and related fields. So I just wanted to make a plug for the QCL Research Network. We've been involved in various events as part of the Festival of Culture, and we organise a programme of events each year. And if you're interested in being on our mailing list, then you can sign up at the end of this event. I've got a piece of paper here, and if you have a pen, please do sign your name, and you'll find out more about the events that we offer. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So, without any further delay, let me introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Justin Bengry, who's a lecturer in queer studies at Goldsmiths. Justin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. So, as we all know, 1967 and the Sexual Offences Act is being celebrated in a variety of ways. The anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Act this year, as you've seen with all kinds of events, including this one across London. And elsewhere. And as much as we're celebrating that date, we should also rightfully think about the 1967 Act and not only what was decriminalized, but also how categories of sexuality and categories of individuals were defined by the 1967 Act. Who was included, who was excluded, what kind of definitions were imposed that have implications to this very day. And certainly the implications of the 1967 Act are being debated to this very day. This year, there's been a lot of discussion about the pardons and disregards of past of historical homosexual offences, of convictions and cautions for homosexual offences. So that remains relevant and incredibly important to many men to this day, and impacts them right to now. And that's something that we have to think about, because it has those issues all the way back to 67. What I want to do, though, is to sort of set that up a little bit with some of the law that came before that, just to give us a little bit of background. So homosexual offenses entered the criminal law in 1533 with the Buggery Act, which criminalized buggery, anal sex, between mankind and beast. This was a criminal offense that was punishable by death. And there's a whole history of that through the early modern period of how that was applied for political means, for a range of means through that period. That has its own entire history. But the last execution for homosexual offenses was in 1835 when James Smith and James Pratt were executed. It was removed as a capital offense from the statute books in 1861 and replaced by 10 years to life imprisonment. So 1861, 1861 is a significant date in this history. 1885 is another one that has implications for 1967 and ongoing histories, because that's the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which then criminalized gross indecency. It created the category of gross indecency, which therefore then criminalized all homosexual acts between men short of buggery. So everything else that could be deemed to be a sexual act between men was punishable by 2 years imprisonment with or without hard labor, up to 2 years imprisonment with or without hard labor. At the time, this only applied to men, but that doesn't mean that women weren't also the interest of potentially of legislation and also of the police. In 1921, it did come up for discussion to possibly criminalize sexual acts between women and create a category of gross indecency that was discussed in the Lords. This was defeated, but as we'll discuss a bit later, women could still be subject to breaches of the peace and other action up into this century. Into the 20th century, it's important to remember that throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, men who were convicted of homosexual offenses were often shamed in their communities, reported in the papers. If you were to look at the News of the World, for instance, in the 40s and the 50s, you would see chain cases, for instance, where names of men would be reported, 10, 15 in some cases, some notorious cases, and their full names and addresses given. That kind of information was presented to the nation, not just their individual community, but appeared in tabloids in the national press. Through the 1950s, we saw quite a lot of police activity and quite a lot of and drew the attention of the press. Of course, there had been convictions for a long time, but this interest in the press in pushing this as an issue of public outrage and public concern really accelerated in the 1950s, to the point that's when it came under consideration by the government and by cabinet with what eventually turned into interest in possible partial decriminalization. But that wasn't the intent in the first place. Certainly, in the cabinet papers that I've looked at, there was no agreement as to how things would move forward, what form it would take, a royal commission, an inquiry, whether it would be to harden and stiffen the laws against homosexual acts, or whether decriminalization was even on the table. What was the greatest concern of legislators, of the cabinet at the time, was press interest in homosexuality and the scandal of homosexuality. So we hear quite commonly the suggestion that it was only once high-profile cases like Lord Montagu and others were being heard and were being tried and convicted that this became a real interest for the state. But in fact, it had already come under question because of this concern about greater discussion and the profitable use of scandal to try and sell the papers. It was explicitly discussed in these ways at the time. So Churchill in 1951-52 wanted not for the government to move forward on legislation to deal with homosexuality, but in fact to have a private member's bill put forward that would restrict the power of the press to discuss homosexuality at all. So this, in effect, restricting the freedom of the press. And of course, this was debated by cabinet members who recognized rightfully what the implications of this were. Eventually, what we see they came to was the striking of the Wolfenden Committee, which sat from 1954 to 1957. And the Wolfenden Committee eventually recommended the partial decriminalization of homosexuality, which was then enacted 10 years later. In the meantime, the 1956 Sexual Offenses Act further added to the arsenal of crimes that could be leveled against men for homosexual acts, adding solicitation for immoral purpose. And that's one that men, up until the 90s really, we're being charged with still and are actually having to deal with now in the issue of pardons and disregards, because solicitation in some form still exists on the books, and solicitation was not included among pardonable offenses. The 1967 Sexual Offences Act, so to get to the title of what we're discussing here today, of course only partially decriminalized same-sex sexual acts between men if they were over 21 in England and Wales. It excluded Scotland, which homosexual sexual acts were only decriminalized in 1980, Northern Ireland, 1982. It also excluded the armed forces and the merchant navy. And critically, it wrote into the statute specifically offenses that were committed in a toilet, in a public lavatory. And that's something that has had a long history now coming forward since then, because the issue of acts committed in a toilet remains a stumbling block around pardons and around disregards, and written right up until the amendment to the policing and crime bill this last year still left intact offenses committed in a toilet as unpardonable, undisregardable. So this becomes really interesting to think about who is acceptable, who is tolerated, who is excluded in this period. Clearly what's being defined as an acceptable form of homosexuality is private homosexual acts between two men, ultimately a monogamous couple, in private, away from the eyes of others, not involving others, not involving the forces, not involving anyone under the age of 21. This is clearly defining a certain kind of acceptable homosexuality that it has then had implications thereafter as men continued to be impacted by these laws going forward after 67. So partial decriminalization, it's always important to remember the partial part of this, because the numbers actually increased after 1967. Many men continued to be cautioned, convicted, charged after that period. In fact, incidents of indecency between men doubled between 1967 and 1977. When we add in a range of convictions for sodomy, soliciting, and procuring, 1989, in fact, saw the highest number of arrests and prosecutions for consensual sex between men since records began. So that was, there was 2,000, in 1989, 2,022 prosecutions for indecency in England and Wales, 3,065 when we include the other numbers. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, couples could be apprehended by the police for public displays of affection, kissing in public, under breaches of the peace legislation. So those continue to impact people as well. Operation Spanner, the Bolton Seven, continued to criminalize men that were having sex in groups larger than two through that period as well. I just want to finish quickly with the actual pardons themselves. So the 2012 Protection of Freedoms Act created a disregard scheme, disregards that would then deem any conviction listed among those that were allowable as effectively spent or ignored. It only included buggery and gross indecency, those two main ones that had started from 1533 and then been created, gross indecency, in 1885. These other crimes of soliciting, importuning, and others were not covered by the disregard scheme at all. And then recently, when pardons were added to the mix earlier this year, well, we had the pardon of Alan Turing in 2013, and then a lot of activism around having that extended to others beyond the royal pardon that was given to Turing. The pardons that were initiated this year only built on what was already there for the disregards, and a pardon is only possible if a conviction has already been disregarded. So only that very limited number of crimes, offenses, is even pardonable. The very last point I just want to make quickly is that the Home Office had released numbers some time ago that there had been an estimate of 50,000 convictions for homosexual offenses. And in, I believe, 2010, 16,000 of those were supposedly eligible for possible disregard. Between October 2012, when this disregard scheme came into effect, and March 2017, when I got a Freedom of Information request supplied to me, 327 of those individuals had applied for disregards. Only 113 had had their convictions disregarded. That means that as of March, only 113 men were actually eligible for a pardon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin, for that very fluent and scholarly summary of the history of the Sexual Offences Act. So we'll move straight on, and I'd like now to introduce Professor Jonathan Bell, who's director of the UCL Institute for the Americas,
Thank you very much.
Nod at 8 minutes.
I hope I'm one to get to the wine, so I hope I won't run over. I'll try my best. Thank you all for coming, and it's very nice to see so many people here this evening. As you may have heard from the introduction, my research specialism is the history of the United States. So while we're here tonight really to think about and reflect on both where we've come from in 50 years since the passage of reform to both homosexual law reform and abortion law reform 50 years ago in the UK, what can we learn perhaps from taking a transatlantic look at sexual freedom and the idea of a sexual revolution, and think of it in terms of what was going on elsewhere in the world? And I will just think about the United States. In 1967, there's no landmark legislation I can point to take us through where we might go with this. But there was, of course, a gathering in the summer of 1967 in San Francisco, which became known as the Summer of Love, where around 100,000 people descended on the Haight-Ashbury district of that city to experiment with their sexuality, with drugs, with community building. And it was an important landmark event in a number of ways, not just in terms of the sense that people were embodying that sense of freedom and liberation that we think of when we imagine the 60s broadly defined, but also actually in terms of developing a politics of sexuality that would become increasingly important as both people's control over their own reproductive rights and their own sexuality became increasingly central to politics later in the 20th century and obviously now. Those political things would include, for instance, in the Summer of Love, the provision of free sexual health clinics. And San Francisco was a pioneer in that period in establishing sexual health as being a public good that actually needed to be provided for people without them having to either be unable to access it legally and, of course, unable to access it financially. And I think the politics of all of that are very raw in my mind at the moment, which is why I haven't had very much sleep for the last 24 hours. Mm-hmm. But the Summer of Love may have been going on, but for many Americans, sexual liberation and the idea of a sexual revolution was very far from being a reality. And central to that problem, of course, was the fact that there wasn't any landmark legislation or a sense that, in fact, control over your own sexual destiny was an individual right that you had. In 1967, only one state in the whole of the United States had decriminalized what were called unnatural acts, or what in many legislation around the states was crimes against nature. Legal sex everywhere but Illinois meant procreative sex. So in every state's criminal statutes in 1967, sodomy was illegal. In almost all states, that was heterosexual or same-sex. It didn't really matter. And oral sex was criminalized in all but a handful of states. Anything that wasn't actually procreative was illegal. Unnatural acts were specified to include everybody, but the 60s really symbolized a time where there was going to be a political move to say actually people's individual private acts, and again we do talk, Justin was talking before about this idea of privacy and what goes on in your own home, there was clearly going to have to be change to the legal statutes after the 1960s. This idea of procreation being the only way in which people were having sex was clearly a nonsense, and state legislatures were very aware of this and started to reform the law. But in so doing, state politicians were identifying, after sexual and the revolutions of the 60s we think of in terms of same-sex sexuality and individual sexual rights, they were redrafting the legislation, not just to eliminate proscriptions on what you could do, but to define new categories of what was acceptable and unacceptable in public policy and in your own private lives. So at the end of the 60s, there was increasingly a move politically to revise and change people's rights in their own control over their own bodies. Obviously, this involved all sorts of things. In 1965, for instance, there had been a landmark Supreme Court case, Griswold versus Connecticut, that legalized and made a right to contraception for the first time in the United States on the explicit grounds that people had a right to privacy, that what they did in their private lives was not the concern of the state. But that did not necessarily have to extend to same-sex sexuality or in any form of sexual minority status. When states started to revise their sexual laws, they did so sometimes to create new ideas of what was acceptable and unacceptable. In 1969, Kansas was the first state to repeal laws banning anal and oral intercourse, but specifically for same-sex, for opposite-sex couples. And they kept very deliberately the proscription against it for same-sex sexuality. Kentucky did the same thing a few years later, getting rid of laws banning non-procreative sex for heterosexuals, but keeping it for same-sex sexuality, creating a category of the criminalized for those who were not within the bounds of heteronormativity. Some states did repeal those prescriptions for everybody. Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, California, and several others during the 1970s did simply abolish all of those laws for everybody. But other states were very clear that they wanted to use the law to create a pushback against sexual liberation, and a clear sense that this was not going to be acceptable. In 1974, Montana replaced in their statutes the term crimes against nature with a new term, deviant sexual relations, that explicitly criminalized same-sex sexuality, very specifically in their statutes for the first time. Pennsylvania in 1975 revised their statutes to allow anal and oral sex for only married people. So even unmarried heterosexuals were still criminalized in that statute. And so in a sense, what you have in this period is both at the social grassroots level, new moves towards sexual liberation and the idea of whether it be gay liberation, second wave feminism, all of the movements that have done so much to shape people's individual rights in the United States and more broadly in the last 50 years, those are happening in tandem with the development of new state powers and regulatory oversight over people's sexuality. Some of it more liberal, if we can use that term, than before, and some of it definitely not. The very openness of people by the 1970s to be free about who they were put them more and more under the gaze of the regulatory state. A very good example of this, I'm going to give you two examples, one of them about same-sex sexuality and one of them about women's reproductive rights. Same-sex sexuality, in 1979, Carl Hill, a British tourist, arrived at San Francisco Airport with a pride badge on him. When he arrived, he was promptly arrested at San Francisco by immigration authorities and charged with the intention to commit same-sex acts, which were still criminalized in federal immigration law, that even for tourism or for any form of immigration, same-sex sexuality was banned until 1990 in the United States. So he was deported, and it was a big cause célèbre. The idea that the immigration authorities had to police people's individual behaviors, and if they suspected people were going to commit same-sex unnatural acts, they would be deported from the United States. The second example I would give you is related to the landmark Supreme Court case of 1973, Roe versus Wade, that gave women, at least in theory, it's still become incredibly contested and difficult political terrain, the right to their own reproductive choices. Immediately that Roe versus Wade was passed and was handed down from the court, state governments thought, and the federal government thought of ways of restricting and managing and limiting a woman's right to choose through all sorts of legal and legislative chicanery. An example of this being the use of Medicaid, the system for the poor, particularly poor women, to access health care after 1965. Medicaid, Congress passed an amendment in 1976 to specifically ban the use of government Medicaid money for access to reproductive health services, and in particular abortion. So those examples show that just as people are gaining more sense of rights and self, they are also coming under the gaze of the state. And I think that's something that we always have to bear in mind when we think about legacies of sexual revolutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It gets incredibly complicated when you start to go through both what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic and all the twists and turns of it. So thank you very much for that very clear presentation. We'll move on then to next speaker, who's Anne Furedi, who's the Chief Executive of BPAS, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. Anne. Would you like a nod, or you?
Yes, please.
8 minutes.
Yeah, give me we'll just say shut up. It usually works. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me to contribute. 50 years seems an awfully long time. And it's very helpful to be following the two talks that we've just had, because when we think of abortion, I think we tend to think of it and situate it very much in the context of women's rights and women's liberation. And it's sometimes mistakenly, I think, viewed that the 1967 Act was a product of the women's liberation movement in Britain, which in fact it really wasn't. It predated the whole emergence of a women's liberation movement in this country. And I think the talks that we've just had in some ways demonstrates just how conservative opinion really was at that particular time. When we're talking about 1967 being the period of the Summer of Love in San Francisco, we're talking about 1967 being the time that the abortion law reform was passed in Britain. It becomes pretty clear that the period of time that we were working, well, not me because I was too young, but the period of time when people were working for that act to be passed was not the context of the Summer of Love. It was something that ran before it. And indeed, it's always very interesting to me that when we speak, and I know and love very many of the people who were involved in campaigning for the 1967 Act, but these are not people who are generally hotbed radical lefties. They often are very conservative individuals whose notion about abortion is perhaps quite different to the way that we see it now. So I think that's one thought to have at the back of your mind, that the 1967 Act was not really about women's liberation. It was actually about a different social agenda altogether, and one that really represented a social agenda of emerging Labour Party politics of the 1960s, which was much more about social and economic reform and ways in which society could take responsibility to stop people from falling through the social net. The 1967 Abortion Act was more about a kind of helping to frame the way that society could deal with particular problems rather than about freeing women. So in some ways, I think the 67 Act was a product of its times. One thing that strikes you about the 67 Act, in a way that it was a product of its times, is when you see it, it's actually a very short piece of legislation. You know, it really does strike you. It's about 3 sides of the little Hansard book. You look at something like the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act, it's reams of it, you know, it's like, it really is absolutely colossal. And one of the things about the 67 Act is that it appears to be quite loosely framed. It's quite open to interpretation, as indeed we found fairly recently when there have been discussions about what doctors can and can't do under it. And there's been a real rewriting of history of people saying one of the reasons why it's quite open to interpretation is because it was a backbench piece of legislation and maybe there was something a bit sloppy in the drafting, which is completely not the case. One of the reasons why it was quite open to interpretation is because the medical profession were absolutely adamant that they did not want politicians nosing about in their business and trying to restrict what it was they were actually doing. In fact, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Royal College of GPs, the British Medical Association took quite a lot of convincing that there should be a parliamentary act that actually determined when they could and when they couldn't do procedures. And that was, again, a big difference in the 1960s. One of the things that bothers me quite a lot today is when doctors are saying, oh, well, we can't really take these decisions, we can't make these interpretive things, we want things drawn more tightly. In those days, there was a bit of a kind of a hands-off attitude. So what the 67 Act really did was, we talk about it as legalizing abortion. When you read the 67 Act, what it did is it actually reinforces the fact that abortion is illegal. It starts off by saying that, by reconfirming that abortion is an unlawful act. And that was important. It was important because in the 1960s, it was the case that the number of abortions that were being carried out by doctors who were loosely interpreting the prior 1861 legislation were actually becoming more and more frequent. It's estimated that in 1966, the year before the Act was passed, more than 10,000 abortions took place in NHS hospitals by doctors who were prepared to carry out terminations on the basis that to not do so would be to threaten the woman's life. It's evident that more and more women outside of hospitals were obtaining drugs that would bring on their periods, that would start cramping and bleeding, that were advertised quite openly in medical magazines. And we think about abortion outside of the law as being about rusty coat hangers and so on, and some of it clearly was, and was really threatening women's lives, but a lot of it wasn't. And I think that you can make a very good case. Sally Sheldon, Professor Sheldon, law professor at Kent University, makes a case very compellingly that the 67 Act is as much about controlling abortion as it was about permitting it. And the law reinforced that abortion would be unlawful unless it were carried out by a doctor, unless it was carried out in licensed premises, and unless women met certain grounds. And those grounds really can be summed up in 2 ways. Abortion was illegal largely unless a woman would be an unfit mother, you know, unless she was going to be damaged in some way by having a child, unless having a child would damage her physical or mental health. So she can have an abortion, she can only have an abortion if having a baby would be a huge problem for her or the existing children in her family. Existing children in her family, that's really this reference to poverty, if she were too poor to be able to bring up her children. And if you read the medical papers of the day, they are absolutely terrifying in what doctors who were arguing for the 1967 Act were saying. They were very clear that the women who should be having abortions were those women with the snivelling, snotty-nosed, out-of-control brats described in one letter. There's one doctor who's arguing that not only should we be able to give these women abortions, but we should be able to insist that these women had abortions. This was not about choice. This was about doctors basically saying that some women really could not handle having kids, rather than perhaps looking at better housing, better benefits, better education. They're thinking about abortion. And of course, the other thing that really shaped it was that clause E, round E, about fetal abnormality, which was largely because this was the age of thalidomide, when it was the case that doctors knew that they had prescribed a drug which could cause congenital abnormalities, and that was a very difficult thing for them to swallow. So basically, we had a law that said that abortion should be controlled, only doctors can do it, only in licensed premises, only to women who would either be unfit mothers or would have unfit children. So this was not a product of women's choice. It wasn't designed to bring about women's choice. It was really designed to bring about a very controlled procedure. What it has done is it has demonstrated over the years quite how safe abortion can be. At the time, it was thought that abortion was quite a risky operation. We've now demonstrated that abortion is incredibly safe. In fact, statistically, it's safer than carrying a pregnancy to term. And it's also created a situation where I think it's demonstrated how tolerant society is now to the notion that no woman should be compelled to carry a child to term, to carry a pregnancy to term when she doesn't want to have a child. And so now when we think about abortion, because this law is interpreted in the way that it is, a huge proportion of abortions are carried out because we have a woman who is unwillingly pregnant. And I think that puts us on the verge now of being able to take the law to the very next stage, to call for the decriminalisation of abortion, much as we must call for the decriminalisation and the deregulation of every aspect, I think, of our private lives and our sexuality and our decisions about family planning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Crystal clear as ever. Thank you. So for our final speaker, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Lisa Halgarten, who is a writer and reproductive rights advocate. Lisa.
Hi. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, please, definitely, yeah.
It seems to work, this.
So this was I put a presentation together for something in a very different context, which involved lots of glitter and glamour, and it was a party, actually, celebrating the two acts, and I don't have the glitter and glamour with me. I was trying to think about how to represent in a sort of very visual way the intersection between these two things, which were abortion rights and reproductive rights on the one hand and LGBT rights on the other. So I'm going to ask you to imagine this scenario, which is that I had two quite scantily clad glamorous men holding up silvery hula hoops in the sort of format of a Venn diagram. And I asked the audience, I'm going to ask you for some audience participation, which you're already not going to like after the night we've had, but I'm going to ask you nonetheless, to tell me whether the statement I'm making fits in LGBT rights or reproductive rights. So, the long shadow of Victorian laws still denying people their rights across the Commonwealth. Where does that go? LGBT rights or abortion rights or? Both. Okay. So I think it's really, really interesting hearing that one of the acts that you mentioned around, I think it was you actually, around unnatural behaviour was in 1861, which was also the time when the Offences Against the Person Act was passed, which criminalised abortion. And what we see when we look around the British Commonwealth and ex-British colonies is that their laws are still completely anchored those two pieces of legislation. So we still have things like Penal Code 377 in India, which criminalises, I think it's been in and out of the law, hasn't it, for the last few years, but we have it in Singapore, all over Asia and the Pacific and Africa. We have the hangover of laws that criminalised homosexuality and which are still being used to criminalise, imprison and sometimes murder people from the LGBT community. And at the same time, those Commonwealth countries are still hanging on to the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, and we still have criminal abortion in many parts of the world. We still have thousands of women a year dying from unsafe abortion as a result of that hangover from colonial times, as well as millions of women being injured in multiple ways as a result of it. So, Northern Ireland, resisting progress on rights. Is that LGBT rights? Or is that abortion rights? Okay. I think you know the answer to these. It seems like a really significant day to talk about this, actually, because Northern Ireland is still resisting the introduction of equal marriage, which I don't see as the be-all and end-all, but it's certainly a good proxy for what the feelings are around particularly issues in a country, and still resisting taking on abortion rights. So when we passed the 1967 Act in Britain, it applied to England, Scotland and Wales. Northern Ireland still doesn't have legal abortion and doesn't show a huge likelihood of getting it anytime soon. And the reason this feels incredibly topical is we are now going to have a minority Tory government propped up by the DUP, who are the absolute defenders of conservatism in every form. And I think we have to be really concerned about that for lots of reasons. One of the things that we're looking at as a reproductive rights movement was finding ways to use the human rights conventions to extend some bit of abortion rights to Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's been found wanting by many human rights instruments, in the light of many human rights instruments, and we were getting to a point where we thought we could persuade the UK government that given that they have responsibility for human rights, they should actually enforce some kind of extension of the Abortion Act, even in some limited way around, if it's going to be around sexual offences, pregnancy caused by a sexual offence, or around fetal anomaly. I don't think that's going to happen with a minority government propped up by the DUP, so bad times. It's interesting, in the Republic of Ireland, the hopes are very high after the equal marriage legislation that somehow this mood of celebration and liberalness would carry over to abortion, and that we would see the repeal of the 8th Amendment, which prevents abortion being legalised because it gives the fetus the equal right to life as the woman. And we haven't seen that. And it was interesting last week seeing people celebrating in the papers that Leo Varadkar won leadership of Fine Gael and will probably end up being the Prime Minister. And people were saying, gay son of Indian immigrant to become Irish PM, as if this was a sign that everything was liberalising and falling away. He's actually not a great advocate for abortion rights and has been quite obstructive in many ways. And I think that's really interesting, and it brings me to the reason why I did this talk originally, which is that it feels like there's been a lot more traction for the LGBT rights movement than there has for the abortion rights movement, and certainly in America, at a point where people were celebrating equal marriage for the first time, there were abortion clinics shutting their doors all over America as state legislatures passed law after law after law to actually make providing abortion extremely difficult. So we have this great piece of federal legislation, this thing in the Constitution which says that you have the right to privacy, and under that right you have the right, nobody can stop you having an abortion, but actually what's happening at the state level is very, very obstructive, and we could talk about that for hours, but I won't. So, people who may need access to abortion, is that just about abortion rights, or is that about the LGBT community too? We all know the answer. They all go in the middle. They all go in the middle. I think people forget that it's not just heterosexual women who need access to abortion. Lesbian women, trans men, intersex people, non-binary people, there are a whole range of people who need access to abortion. I remember several years ago a colleague of mine who I work with very closely trying to go into an LGBT youth club to do some work around pregnancy decision-making and abortion, and nobody wanted to open the doors to her. They said they don't really see why this is relevant, but actually there was quite a lot of evidence that young people, there was a quite high teenage pregnancy rate amongst young gay women, and actually there's quite a high level of penis and vagina sex amongst men and women who identify as gay, and that might be about social pressures, it might be about experimenting to see whether actually they're sure about their identity, but they're most likely not to have had the information and support to protect themselves from pregnancy. Of course, lesbians, trans men, non-binary, intersex people, they're as likely as heterosexual women to experience the need for abortion because of rape, because in pregnancy they have an obstetric complication, or the impact of an existing health condition on the pregnancy is such that they need to end the pregnancy for their own health. There may be a diagnosis of fetal anomaly, a risk to their own life, or a change of circumstance that makes them want an abortion. So there's not that many people left, actually, who don't need access to abortion, it seems to me. So it's about sex, stupid. Fornication without procreation is a sin. Where does that go? So I think that it's really important never to get away from the fact that this is not about babies and fetuses when people are upset about the idea of abortion. However much the anti-abortion movement tries to make this about babies, we know that they're also very opposed to contraception, and underlying everything is a thing about sexual morality. And it comes out in many, many ways, but one of them is that they're absolutely obsessed with anal sex. Have you noticed that religious zealots are obsessed with anal sex? And that's got nothing to do with babies and fetuses whatsoever. Although anti-abortionists will tell you it's about the sanctity of life, it really isn't. It's about the fact that women being able to control their sexuality, have sex for pleasure, is the sort of mirror image of the Virgin Mary, who was able to have a baby without having sex, which is a bloody clever trick. So however much they try and make us about that, we know it's not about we know it's not about babies. We know it's entirely about sexual morality. So young people deprived of good information about this. Young people in schools are not getting good information about LGBT issues. They're not getting it about abortion. Sometimes the same people like SPUC, the Society for Protection of Unborn Children, go into schools and they are homophobes and they're anti-abortion, which is quite neatly wraps things up. It's a health issue, clearly. I'm not going to go into these. I don't have time for all this nonsense. It's an equalities issue. It's a human rights issue. And it's a life and death issue for both groups of people who need access to abortion and LGBT people. Whether it's the rape and murder of people because of their gender or sexuality, whether it's state-sanctioned and police violence against LGBT people, which is rife around the world. There are still 10 countries where homosexuality is punishable by death, and 47,000 people a year die from unsafe abortion globally. So clearly, prejudice that underlies the kind of prescriptive and restrictive legislation is actually a life and death issue. The reason I wanted to do the talk in the first place at the previous event was because it feels like this is a year where we should be doing a bit more around solidarity and intersectionality, and recognising that these rights are all come down to bodily autonomy. And it would be really nice to feel that that people from the LGBT movement could try and leverage their supporters to support the abortion rights movement and vice versa. So I know the audience here will include political activists and health activists and clinicians, and there is a challenge going forward for us to recognise our shared roots, and I think we've heard quite a lot about that today, our shared concerns and also our common enemy, and look for opportunities to make connections. And finally, I think we need to find a really good language for talking about reproductive rights and abortion, which is inclusive. Whether we're talking about patient information or campaign materials, we need to remember that reproductive rights are not just for women. Lots of people who aren't women need contraception, abortion, assisted fertility, and a whole range of reproductive health treatments. But we also need to be able to say at the same time that reproductive rights is a woman's issue, because the ability to choose or not the number, timing and spacing of your children is something that overwhelmingly impacts women. So 1 in 3 women will have an abortion. It's a really powerful and important statistic, both for advocacy and for thinking of funding and organising services. And it simply is not statistically true to say that 1 in 3 people will have an abortion. So, because it's not an accident that abortion is, it's not an accident it's so contested, it's not an accident that it's a function of centuries-old misogyny. Gloria Steinem once said, if men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. So, I don't know what the language is that we need to find, which is both inclusive, and I think that's really, really important, and also allows us to recognise that abortion is the cornerstone of women's liberation. It plays the most important part in women's lives. So I'm really up for having a conversation about that. Fighting for women's autonomy and agency and right to make decisions doesn't preclude and must include fighting for everyone's.
Thank you, Lisa. That was wonderful. And thank you again to all our speakers for giving such interesting talks, sticking to time. Which means, happily, that we've got a good half hour or more for discussion and questions and answers with the audience. Before we start that, and because we're at UCL, I thought I'd just mention this is part of the UCL's Festival of Culture. So if you go online and look at what that is, there's a whole range of really interesting events that some of you might want to go to. It also strikes me being at UCL Intersectionality, which I only discovered what that meant quite recently. But we, at the Institute for Women's Health, has just got an Athena Swan Gold Award, which we're all terribly proud of. And what that's about, for those of you who don't know, is initially it was about gender equality and supporting women's careers in higher education. And now it's completely about intersectionality, about equality much more broadly. So that kind of shift that you alluded to of talking about intersectionality in a broader issue is certainly taking place in higher education, or the spotlight's on it at universities. And I think that's very important, and I'm glad that the Institute for Women's Health has played its part in that. So that's probably enough from me. Let's hand over the floor to the audience. I'll probably take questions in small groups, because I expect many of you have got things to say.